He is a senior editor in Times of India, and he is in love with history as a student, as a writer, and his writing really catch me and most of the readers. Recently, his book Allahu Akbar: Understanding the Great Mughal in Today's India was published by Bloomsbury, and really this book is a unique account. Why I will say it's not simple biographical account; it's a connecting account with the chronological event of past and present. So suddenly you will find that money is switching to Ottomans. Suddenly he's switching to Greeks. So it's vertically and horizontally integrated with the timeline. Suddenly he's switching to 20th, 21st century India. So with the today's political scenario. So you will find a mix of different things connected together by the string of Akbar. This is really something very unique sort of writing that he played around in this book. Now let us introduce my second honorable guest. Thank for him to joining today, Mr. Moin Mir. Moin is from England, and he is one of the family members or the descendants from the royal family of Surat or the Nawabs of Surat, and blessed to be the descendant of Maudud Chishti, one of the famous founders of the Chishti order from 12th century. And Moin loves poetry, Moin loves Sufism and philosophies of the Sufism. And really, from last 3 or 4 days, I'm enjoying reading his book. And before that, I came in touch when he started his Instagram talks with William Dalrymple by the Rowley Books. And really, it was very nice conversation. So this turned my attention of 2017 book, Surat, the fall of the poet and the rise of a prince. So then I purchased the book and read the book, and finally Moin came in to join our session. Thank you, Moin. Just a few words you want to add, both of you.
Thank you very much. Please go, Mani Saab. Your.
Yes, Mani. So can we start with the?
I'm delighted. I'm delighted to make acquaintance of Moin Saab. In fact, like you said, I also watched his talks along with William Dalrymple on Rowley Books page when lockdown started. I was very inspired by whatever he said. And and I could say that I'm now touched by royalty that way, you know. Having a conversation with somebody from the.
Mani, your connection is, I think, your connection is getting stuck in between. Your connection is getting stuck in between, I think. Your face is now, your video is stopped.
From your end,
yeah,
I think it's from my end. I've just turned off my Wi-Fi. Okay.
Okay.
So yes, I was saying that we're delighted to be in this Facebook Live with Moin Mir Sahab, and so I'm really curious to know more about his side of the story and how he really found out about this fascinating tale in his own family. So I'm sure he will delight us with all those stories. So I'm more as a listener here today than as a speaker, because it is his subject area really that we'll be talking about. So Moin Mir Sahab, the floor is all yours. So
Moin, your first chapter started the context that Mani described in his book when the Ter Bakht Khan entered in. So you briefly described about the time or the situation of the Surat just before that, during the days of Mughals. So I would like to, Mani, just give small glimpses of the days when Akbar entered in the Surat. He found some cannons of Sultan Salim during his seizing of the fort, and that mighty fort was used by the military technology. He used it to capture or laid the siege of the Surat. That was one of the last resort in the Gujarat that he did it with his firm determination. So something on the military warfare on that you want to add it, Mani?
Yeah, so as you know that Gujarat was really essential to essential for the expansion of the Mughal Empire and its stability, because for these kind of expansions there's always a military reason, because the Mughals relied heavily on the war horse, and the war horse used to come from Iraq, from that side, the Iraqi horse or the Arab horse. So all these trade routes used to pass through Gujarat and Rajputana. And of course the maritime route was also very important, because Khambat or Cambay was a very important maritime port, and as long as Mughals did not control Khandesh, they had to use the route via Ajmer to access the ports on the western part of the country. So that's why, at some point, a conquest or an invasion of Gujarat would have happened. So it happened in the 1570s, early 1570s, 72 when he's first asked by Atmad Khan, who was really the kingmaker of the Sultanate of Gujarat. So he was, he had toppled one king and, propped up another, and now he was, controlling everything, and there was a rebellion against him. So there were the Afghans who were there at Patan, so they invaded, and then suddenly Atmad Khan figured out that, he was completely surrounded.
Yes.
So then he asked for Akbar's intervention. So that's how really, Akbar decided to go in. Plus, the other thing which was happening was there was a revolt which was going on against Akbar by these Mirzas. They were also Timurid princes. So
Yes.
Akbar could not have killed them because that was like, royal family themselves. So, he kept on fighting them, first to Malwa, then they escaped to Gujarat. And eventually when you see Surat, the garrison of Surat was actually controlled by Shah Mirza, who was one of the three Mirza princes, who had rebelled against Akbar's authority. So that's how the invasion happens of Gujarat. And Ahmedabad is taken. There was a great celebration. Then, of course, onwards, they go to Surat after defeating the Gujarat Sultan. And then they go to Surat, and by that time they had perfected the art of forming sabats, or these covered trenches, and also raising mounds to place their guns. So you'd have these artificial hillocks that were created so that the artillery could be placed, and that would give elevation to your guns, so that when you fire, you just don't hit the walls, you actually hit the buildings inside the fort.
Yes.
So, that was a game changer tactic of its time. And you see that Akbar had used it at Chittor first, then at Ranthambore again, and now at Surat. And the same officers were, in charge of doing these. One was Todarmal, the other was the Mir Beher. So, and then the Mirzas, they appealed for Portuguese help. And the Portuguese fleet arrived, to help, because that's how the Sultan of Gujarat, erstwhile Sultan of Gujarat, Bahadur Shah, had also done, while fighting Humayun. So he had ceded control of Daman and Diu in exchange for Portuguese support against Humayun. So it was really a continuation of the same policy. But this time the Portuguese fleet arrived and saw that Akbar had immense firepower, these huge siege guns, which were called the Zarbzan. So they realized that probably it would be a futile exercise to challenge the Mughal army that was there. So they instead sent a peace mission. And Akbar, being a pragmatic man, he accepted the offer. The Gujarat garrison felt betrayed completely, because they had asked the Portuguese for help. The Portuguese come, but then they side with the Mughals. They say that we can't help you because this is a much stronger army. So that's how Surat falls, really, because they cannot withstand the siege for a long time, and eventually the Mirzas escape, and the garrison is left to its fate, and they eventually surrender. They had to. So that's how Surat was conquered by the Mughals. And I think Moin Mir Sahab can take us beyond that.
Yeah. So Moin, now Surat being a strategic location, and it's look like cities of the fairy tales. It's one of the most important port where there was a thriving business, a melting pot of the cultures. You will find cities, you will find merchants. And in your book, you took a balanced approach, connecting the anecdotes, narratives, and all the rich information you get it, how you presented the Surat. So can you talk a little bit about that Surat before when Tegh Bahadur Bakht Khan appeared in the Surat?
Yeah, thank you, Mani Saab, for your wonderful insight into how Akbar came to conquer Surat. Well, Surat was, always a very bustling port, and it had attracted a vast number of merchants from all over the world. You had an incredible mix. You had the Armenians trading there. You had the Baghdadi Jews over there. You had the Chalabi Turks over there. You had an enormous amount of the local Hindu population, the Jains, the Muslim Bohras who were active merchants. They owned one of the most, it was said that the merchant ships of Surat were far, far greater in size, and the money that they brought back even rivaled, the ships that the Mughals had, the personal ships of the Mughal emperors. So Shah Jahan, Aurangzeb, they had their own personal ships that would trade. But the merchants of Surat, it is said, had even bigger ships. So that's how wealthy, this incredible merchant mix of Surat was. Now, along with all of that, what you find by the time it is the early 1600s, or probably even before that, to be fair, the Portuguese are already in control of the waters. Now, I think it's very important to understand and establish that the Portuguese had really become this incredible naval giant globally. They were not just, meandering and pottering around Europe or a few little islands in Africa. They were the global naval giant of the world. And by the time their influence spread through the 1500s, you had the Dutch, the French, the English, all of them playing catch up to the Portuguese. But it was Akbar's conquest of Gujarat and Surat, by and large, that actually prompted him to build the first fledgling Mughal army. Because it's an old story in Surat that when he gets into this boat and sails out into the Arabian Sea, he's just mesmerized by the waves. Remember, Akbar was originally North Indian, born in a part of Pakistan, in Umarkot, as we know it, but of Uzbek and of Turk bloodline. So he hadn't really seen the vastness of seas and oceans. He had seen rivers, he had seen lakes, he had seen all of that. But when he gets to Surat and he sees this, he sails down the Tapti and he sees this enormous, enormous sea. He's absolutely astounded by these waves. And it is said that from then on, he takes it on himself to really, create a Mughal fleet or a Mughal navy. Nevertheless, by the time it is Shah Jahan's time, that is Jahangir's time. Sorry, my apologies. But let's just start with Jahangir. By the time it's Jahangir, Surat is really peaking in terms of being this metropolitan port. And it is in Surat that the English, oddly enough, in 1608, if I'm not mistaken, they defeat a very prominent Portuguese naval fleet. And that, oddly enough, spells the death knell of the Portuguese influence on the Arabian waters. Of course, it takes a long time for that, the Portuguese influence to actually fade away. But it is the Battle of Swali. Swali is just, a few kilometers away from Surat, that really, pushes them back and establishes the English East India Company on that thin strip of coastline on the western Indian coast, basically. And along with that comes Sir Thomas Roe. And he lands up in Surat, and he's absolutely mesmerized by the city. He's completely blown over by this eclectic mix in Surat. And he writes back to the King of England saying, Surat is the fountain of all East Indies trade. Now, East Indies trade basically means anything that is flowing from India right down to Indonesia and beyond. And he says that we must be steadfast in holding out against the Dutch and the Portuguese, because Surat is really the gateway to everything when it comes to maritime trade. And immediately he seeks an audience with Jahangir. I mean, a lot of people know that. Jahangir gives him the license to trade. He goes back. And the first establishment, which is a very fledgling, nascent establishment of the East India Company, takes root in Surat, where they set up, a cotton refining factory to send, cotton and spices down to the Malacca. And from then on, the East India Company establishes, a trading fortress, They even start bringing in their ships to dock. Surat's importance as a trading hub continues to grow and swell, and it reaches extraordinary proportions during the time of Aurangzeb. So much so that it becomes, it gets the title of Bab-e-Mecca, which basically
Yes.
means the gateway to
Mecca.
Makkah.
Gateway
Because
to
it is from Surat that you have an extraordinary amount of pilgrims, Muslim pilgrims, going for Hajj. And so you can visualize this eclectic city. It's dotted with fabulous Jain temples. It's dotted with incredible Hindu temples. There's a fantastic mix of Sufi shrines there. Khwaja Dana Saab's shrine is one of the most revered shrines. He was a pir from Baghdad who had come down. You had an extraordinary amount of Armenians who had set up their churches there. And the true reflection of this eclectic mix is when you visit the dockyards of Surat even now, just outside the castle, you will encounter the most beautiful mausoleum of Khudawand Khan, who was the governor of Surat pre-Mughal, and who actually died. And the myth or the legend goes that he took a cannonball, a Portuguese cannonball on his chest, braving the Portuguese attack on Surat. And his mausoleum is still there, beautifully carved in stone. And then you walk a few steps and you'll come across these absolutely astonishing Jain mandirs. They're beautiful in architecture. And as you walk further, you will see these extraordinary cemeteries of the Dutch, of the French, of the English. And the exquisite architecture of these cemeteries is mind-boggling, because they are a mix between Indo-Saracenic and Gothic Christian architecture, which you don't get to see anywhere. So for you folks who haven't visited Surat, I'd urge you just to see these incredible sights and sounds of Surat. Visit, the Bandar Ilaka, as they call it, of Surat, and you'll be absolutely mesmerized by the history of that place. So Surat has peaked during Aurangzeb's time as this fantastic trading outpost, eclectic, as I mentioned, super cosmopolitan and all of that. But with the death of Aurangzeb in 1707, as we all know, anarchy sets into Hindustan, and every prince raises his flag of rebellion, or for that matter, his flag of independence. I'm not going to go too deep into that, because for that you're better off reading The Anarchy, which is written by Willie Dalrymple. I'll cut straight to a passage of play, which is 1733. So between 1707 and 1733, there's absolute anarchy everywhere. Regional powers emerging, Hyder Ali in the south, all of even probably before Hyder Ali, all of that happening. In 1733, the Mutasaddi basically means the governor, or
yes.
Even if you want to call it a rather derogatory term, it means the clerk. Is a very weakened man, and Surat, although still a very prominent trading place, is losing its administrative machinery. And this obviously comes up as an opportunity for the Dutch to lay eyes on Surat, the English, obviously, who are hovering around because they've got Bombay, and they're desperately trying to lure the merchants away from Surat to Bombay so that they can build Bombay and then take tax off the merchants. The administration of Surat is decaying. And the Mutasaddi of Surat is just basically a nominal head left, left as a relic of the past. In these rather turbulent times, in 1733, a soldier of fortune called Tegh Bakht Khan makes his way down from the imperial court, and he's a soldier of fortune, basically, like a lot of the Mughal generals were back then. And he, makes his way into Surat. He's got a reasonable, strong fighting force, and he promises the merchants that he will give them a terrific administrative system. Convinced by his plans to really administer Surat well and pull Surat out of this tug of war that was beginning to arise with the English trying to pull the merchants to to Bombay, the Dutch also playing their games. The merchants of Surat, as I mentioned, who are a mix of Hindus, Jains, Muslims, all of that, they backed Tegh Khan into the gates of Surat. And in walks Tegh Khan under the Mughal insignia, still representing Mughal supremacy, and he takes charge of Surat. Now, Surat at that time was divided. The command of Surat, the Mughals had divided very smartly. There was the fort, which was controlled by the Siddhis, or the Abyssinian slaves, who had also risen to commanding the fort, and the administration of the city they had given to the Mudasaddis. What they did by this divide and rule policy was to ensure that none of these officers really became too powerful to take over the entire city. But with the collapse of the Mughal Empire, for the first time, Surat is ruled by one unifying force called Tegh Khan, who very quickly discards the mantle of Mutasaddi and calls himself the Nawab. And that's the first time that you get to hear the title of the Nawab of Surat being exercised. He applies to the Mughal court for authenticity, to authenticate his claim as the Nawab of Surat, but nothing really comes, from the Mughal court, and he nonchalantly, dismisses it, becomes the Nawab. 21 guns are fired from the cannon, and he now controls the fort as well as the administration of the city. And he, oddly enough, provides tremendous amount of administrative services, and Surat really now starts getting traction again as a port. And you have the merchants coming back to Surat from Bombay. And Surat, once again, gains its luster back, if you wish, under Tegh Khan. This doesn't go very well under in the eyes of the East India Company, who are obviously rubbing their hands and hoping that they can dislodge Tegh Khan and take control of Surat. They fail miserably because he's a very powerful fellow. He's got a very reasonable fighting force. He even strikes a deal with Damaji Gaikwad, and that deal says that I'll pay you an X amount of tax from the city, but do not side with the English East India Company because they are foreigners. So he's very clear in his narrative. The East India Company are foreigners. They have to be kept at bay because they've got an incredibly powerful navy docking in Bombay and in Surat. And so, he strikes a deal with Damaji Gaikwad, and he even strikes a deal with the Nizam of Hyderabad. And this unifying deal of the Nizam, which a lot of people don't know, the Nizam, the Nawab of Surat, and the Gaikwad of Baroda really keep the English East India Company at bay. Unfortunately, Tegh Khan dies in 1739, and there's a clamor for power, a mad rush for power again.
By the way, Moin, sorry, interrupting
Sorry,
in.
I don't want to carry on.
No. Sorry for interrupting in. I just want to tell that a lot of nice feedback is coming from the audiences and friends. They are really enjoying your talk, and they are relishing the session of Surat. Really, so many thanks. And just before going to the Safdar's account, I just want to review a little bit back that how this journey of the book, we want to listen how it was started, when the idea creeped in to write such a fascinating account from you.
Sorry, when did...
I say that before going to the Safdar's account, after Tegh Khan, I just want to listen that how the journey of writing itself started with you as a writer, so to pen down this fascinating account, how it was started actually.
Well, Rehan, thank you so much for that question. For me, this book has always been within me because I grew up between Bombay and Gujarat, between Bombay and Surat and the paternal estate of Kamadhia. So, it's always been with me. My father was born in the Surat Palace. My father moved to Bombay as a young man to study. We spent our weekends in Surat, and we spent the weekdays in Bombay studying, me going to school and all of that. So the story of Surat was always there within me. But what really prompted the book was I as I say, there's always a time for everything in life.
Yes.
But what prompted the book, oddly enough, was when I went for a book launch in London. And the book was called The Last King of India. And it was the story of Nawab Wajid Ali Shah of Awadh. And it was a book written by an incredible scholar called Rosie Llewellyn-Jones. And she tracked the history of the Nawab of Awadh and his fall in 1856. And I was speaking to Rosie Llewellyn-Jones at this book launch in Holborn. And I was flipping through the book, and she had a little mention of the Nawab of Surat Treaty Bill in Parliament in 1856. And she said, I was writing about your ancestor, but unfortunately I could only write a couple of lines. And I said, well, no, that's fine. And it was at that point in time when, I realized that there was so much written about the annexation of the Awadh, about the annexation of Awadh in 1856. There's a lot written about how the English East India Company took Tipu Sultan's Mysore in 1799/1800. There's so much written about the Rani of Jhansi's fight in 1856 when they tried to annex Jhansi. So, and there was a large number of work on the Anglo-Sikh wars when they tried to annex Punjab, but there was nothing on Surat, And it was then that I decided to write a book on how Surat was annexed by the English East India Company. And then the journey began to travel, back to India, because I'm based in London. So back to India, spending time in Surat, interviewing people at the castle, interviewing people in Kamadhia, interviewing people in the libraries, understanding the manuscripts in the libraries in Surat, understanding the manuscripts, because a lot of the manuscripts in Surat are in Persian, because Persian was the official language virtually till 1857. And I speak Urdu fluently, I speak Hindi, and my grandfather was the last in the family to speak Persian, but I needed those Persian documents, to be translated. And then, of course, the incredible debate in the Houses of Parliament in 1856 in Britain, which is the story of the Prince of Surat challenging the East India Company in their own parliament, which was absolutely riveting. So I went back to the libraries here, to the British libraries here, to understand that debate. So that was the journey of the book. It started in London, it went to Surat, it went to Bombay, and then it came back to London.
So thank you, Moin, for this, really sharing the wonderful account. Yes, I know that this was a living book that was residing inside you, but really there was some time when a writer came up with many commitments and find a time and just to pen down itself, whether it's a living with you as a journey of your life, it's really a tough and challenging task. So
we are glad that you had that meeting with Rosie Llewellyn-Jones then. if that acted as the trigger. I'm saying that we are glad that you had the meeting with Rosie Llewellyn-Jones. That if that acted as the trigger.
Mani Saab, if I probably would not have gone for that, and I remember this so vividly. I was exhausted that day, and I was really tired. And I said, where another book launch? But nevertheless, I went there, and if I hadn't gone there, I probably wouldn't have written the book.
There is one of the participants asking a question, Mohit Jain, that which year Surat was under French and then Nawab and East India Company. We will come on that thing. Just in a nutshell, we will tell you the timeline. Moin can share the timeline and they will come in on that. He just want to know that when French was not there.
So Surat was never under the French. So let's just step back. Tegba Khan's death in 1739, and then there is manic chaos, the family infighting. But before Tegba Khan had died, and oddly enough he left behind just one daughter, he had appointed his son-in-law Mia Chand, who was also known as Moinuddin Khan, as his successor. So there was a massive skirmish that went on between Tegba Khan's brother Safdar and Moinuddin. Eventually, I'm going to cut the long story short, it is Moinuddin who wins this battle for succession. He is appointed Nawab of Surat, and Moinuddin is supported by the merchants. He provides, once again, keeping the legacy of his father-in-law alive, he provides an incredible amount of good administration to Surat. He lifts the game as far as the mint is concerned, so that the mint can produce more coins for trading. He encourages Armenians all the way from Armenia to come and make Surat their home. Obviously, all of this is not going down well with the East India Company. Moinuddin Khan, Mir Moinuddin Khan dies and if memory serves me right, in 1759. I'm going to have to refer to my book, but I think he dies at that age, if I'm not mistaken. And he's succeeded by his son Nawab Hafizuddin. Now, this is where the trouble starts. Now, the minute Nawab Hafizuddin succeeds to the Gaddi of Surat, the English East India Company start, begin in their pernicious ways of trying to wrestle back control. And they start making forays into the fort, which is the castle. And once again, start luring merchants to Bombay. You must understand that besides the fight that is going on, or the political churning that is happening between Nawab and East India Company, there is this enormous tug of war between Surat and Bombay, and Bombay is becoming this nemesis for Surat, and Bombay is being championed by the East India Company, and the Nawab is championing Surat. Nevertheless, because of this incredible naval firepower that the English East India Company have on the docks in Surat and on Bombay, they are able to choke Nawab Hafizuddin's ability to trade. And what they do, rather quite treacherously actually, is they shut down the mint in Surat. Now, you can imagine the ramifications for shutting down the mint. So in 1774, they shut down the mint in Surat, which makes trade virtually impossible. They send in these relatively, how would you say? I wouldn't even call them public school educated Englishmen, but these administratively inclined Englishmen who have a myopic thinking of just getting into Surat, to make a quick buck, and they are given to bribes. So bribing takes up this enormous. It raises its monstrous head in Surat, where you can actually bribe an English official to get your ship out to trade, and that is how corrupt the English officials in the East India Company was. So Nawab Hafizuddin in 1774 writes to the English East India Company Court of Directors in London, telling them that, look at what you are doing to Surat. You're wrecking it. You are destroying the merchants. And you're bringing an absolute sense of dismal dismay amongst the merchants, because every merchant now has to bribe the English official to get his ship out to trade, which means the sum of money that the English officials are asking is virtually half the trade income that the Surat merchants are making. Anyways, the English East India Company in Britain, turn a deaf ear. They don't reply to Nawab Hafizuddin, and things take a drastic turn in Surat, because eventually the merchants leave Surat and start moving to Bombay, because the stranglehold that the East India Company has on the Arabian Sea is so strong that the Nawab starts losing control on the waters. And more and more, as time passes, his realm of authority shrinks only to the administration and the civil and civic administration of Surat, rather than controlling trade. That moves into the hands of the English East India Company on the back of their superior naval power, and also, to be fair, on the back of treachery, because they are the ones who actually, through treacherous means, shut down the mint in Surat. On the death of Nawab Hafizuddin, he is succeeded by Nawab Nizamuddin. Nawab Nizamuddin is a relatively weak man who's suffering from cholera, and he dies in 1799. Now, Mani Saab would be very, he would be probably twitching his fingers now, because 1799, as we know, is the time when Tipu Sultan
Tipu Sultan.
falls.
Yes.
So this is the parallels that one, if you're a historian and you love history, you start playing this out in your mind, and you're so engaged with it, because here Nawab Nizamuddin dies in 1799, and it also means the advent of one man called Richard Wellesley, who wants to change the narrative dramatically of the East India Company. He's a man given to conquest. He's not interested in the narrative of the East India Company being a business house. He wants to change the narrative from traders to rulers. And as soon as he lands in India, he picks up arms against the Marathas in Asai, as Mani Saab will validate. He goes to war with Tipu Sultan. There's a massive clash of titans. All of Hindustan is watching with bated breath of this giant, this clash of the titans, so to speak. Wellesley defeats Tipu Sultan. And as soon as he defeats Tipu Sultan, he gets the information and a letter saying that Nawab Nizamuddin in Surat died. And he turns his attention to Surat. And he categorically refuses succession of Nawab Nasiruddin, who is the younger brother of Nawab Nizamuddin, to the Gaddi, because Nawab Nizamuddin dies without any children. And Nawab Nasiruddin writes frantically to Richard Wellesley, saying that I'm, the sole survivor of the family, and I should be, made the Nawab rightfully. So I'm crowning myself. And rightfully, Nawab Nasiruddin does that. He crowns himself Nawab of Surat. Wellesley is enraged, because by now, by the 1800s, the authority of the East India Company is quite strong across a large portion of India. And Wellesley sends in troops, and a message is sent to Nasiruddin that, and this is the high-handedness of the East India Company. The message is sent that here is a treaty, sign it immediately, and otherwise we will invade Surat. That treaty is very clear. We will give you a pension of £15,000. You will be allowed to keep your private estates. Now, the private estates of the Nawab are extraordinary. They're massive. They're probably a third of Surat. There's 7 palaces, enormous amounts of gardens, parks. And so Wellesley says, keep your estates, keep £15,000 as your pension, but you will no longer have ruling and administrative powers. Now, as soon as Nawab Nasiruddin receives this, he considers guerrilla warfare and resistance within the city if Wellesley was to come in and attack. But Nawab Nasiruddin's secretaries, and the merchants prevail upon Nawab Nasiruddin and say, listen, you really cannot match Wellesley's might. The might of Wellesley after defeating Tipu Sultan has sent a shiver down the spine across, every Indian prince. And the fact would be that Wellesley, Surat would go up in flames if he was to enter into an armed conflict. Nawab Nasiruddin is also a relatively aging man, and after much consultation with his inner coterie, he decides to sign the treaty. So the treaty is signed in 1800, and for the first time, Surat falls to the English East India Company in terms of ruling power. So that, Rehan, I would suspect would answer the question of the gentleman who asked, how did that transition happen?
Yes.
So in 1800, Surat is officially annexed, and the ruling powers move from the Nawab to the English East India Company, but the estates, which are a third of Surat, are still controlled by the Nawab. And it's very important for me to establish here what that means. A third of Surat means an extraordinary amount of the city is still under, if not the rule, but how in Urdu there's a word daste-shafqat, which means under the love and affection of the Nawab. So under the love and affection of the Nawab, a third of Surat still finds employment. Textile weavers, potters. Surat is renowned for its textiles. All of these are still under the payroll of the Nawab. So while the administration of the city has left the Nawabship, the Nawabship is still there over the third of Surat in terms of providing employment to the local karigars, to the local, people who work in stables, people who work in the textile industry, and all of that. So it's a very unique kind of a setup that is now taking place. Should I carry on, or are there any questions you'd like me to ask? Or
I think, this is the one chapter. Now the other chapter that Moin will bring in money. This is a new entry of Sarfaraz, because here the book will turn as we go. He talk about Nasiruddin. So now you will find a Kathiawad. So Moin, I just want to bring you here from the other lineage, how Kathiawad and this area, and what's the pronunciation of, you use it for Kamadhia? Kamadhia, huh? Kamadhia. So how these locations and the adventures of Sarfaraz came in, just in crisp, can we share this to the audiences, and Mani also will be interested to listen to that.
Yes, absolutely.
So thank you, Rehan, again. So let's visualize this. Surat has fallen, but it's a very unique setup. The Nawab still has authority. He doesn't. One must understand the difference. He doesn't have power, but he has authority over a third of Surat, and these are subtle differences. Anyways, now as a writer, one also has to be mindful of not romanticizing too much, and Mani Saab does that very well. I've heard his conversations a couple of times on Tipu and all of that. With this kind of pension, which is an extraordinary pension, £15,000, and the ability to keep your estates, a sense of luxurious living sets in to the Nawab of Surat. When Nawab Nasiruddin dies, he's succeeded by his son called Nawab Mir Afzaluddin. Now, Nawab Mir Afzaluddin grows up knowing he doesn't have the administrative responsibilities of Surat. He also grows up knowing that he's assured a pension. He also grows up knowing that he's got these magnificent estates. And he becomes a spoiled child. He's given to opium. He's given to all kinds of addictions. He's given to, caught drunk in his lavish palaces. He's given to his harems, and one can't run and deny that fact. He's also an incredibly poetic man. While he is all of this, the truth is also that he's dearly loved by the people of Surat, because he's a very congenial character. He's a bit like the Nawab of Awadh. Nawab of Awadh had all these idiosyncrasies, but he was genuinely loved by the people of Lucknow. In the same way, the people of Surat really love Nawab Afzaluddin, because he's quite a character. He has these incredible parties. He's very lovable. Let's just put it that way. He has his vices, but he's very lovable. In all of this, Nawab Afzaluddin is a concerned man, because he is blessed only with 2 daughters. And one of them dies in his lifetime, which leaves him only with 1 daughter. And he is now worried that once he dies, the English East India Company might not recognize his daughter as the successor to the estates. And so begins the search for a male heir. Now, he sends a proposal for the crown princes of the fast fading imperial court in Delhi, and 2 princes, Mirza Najaf and Mirza Humayun, make their way to Surat to court Nawab Afzaluddin's daughter. But Nawab Afzaluddin is utterly disappointed, because he sees the reflections of himself in those 2 princes, because he finds them in the opium dens and in the sharab khanas and in the tawaif khanas and the kotas of Surat, and he's deeply pained.
Moin,
He's terribly pained.
Moin, sorry to
Yeah, please
cut
carry on.
in. A very relevant question came in from our friend Khalid bin Umar, who is very passionate history lover and very interested in genealogies. He said, Rehan bhai, I am not able to continue here for long, but I would like to tell you that this family hails originally from Badaयूं, of which Moin is talking from Sahaswan, and their collateral Maududi branch, means from Maudud Chishti, flourish in Badaयूं and other parts of UP. You may please confirm this fact with him and we'll try to come back. He want to
excellent.
Because he is really a very interested guy in genealogies, and he really writes a lot of good stuff.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm very sure that they are very much in Sahaswan, and the Maududi Chishti Gharana is thriving. Thank you so much for your feedback.